An 18-year-old girl was convicted of the brutal murder in 2002.
Lobato was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sexual penetration of a corpse. Her sentence, 13 to 25 years.
That was where the trial really turned. You know, there was doubt in the air.
This is the story of Kirstin Blaise Lobato. Kirstin Blaise Lobato went by her middle name of Blaise. Her mum and dad were not together, so she lived with her mum and her mum's partner. Unfortunately, Blaise's life didn't get off to a great start. It was found out that her mum's partner was sexually abusing Blaise, and this happened when she was around 5 or 6. Because of this, her mum's partner was sent to prison and her mum lost custody of Blaise. So Blaise was sent to go live with her father in Las Vegas. Also, she lived with her stepmother, Becky, and her younger sister, Ashley. So the Lobatos lived a fairly normal life in Las Vegas until they decided to move up north to a little town called Panaca. Panaca was around 3 hours away from Las Vegas. It was 170 miles away. When I say this town was small, I'm not exaggerating. Like, to put this in perspective, the high school that I went to growing up had more people in my school than the whole town of Panaca. Furthermore, Panaca was a highly Mormon town. It was quite conservative. You can kind of imagine the sort of small town I'm talking about here, right? Obviously, moving to a small rural town gave Blaise lots of space to ride her four-wheelers, which she really enjoyed. But to be honest, Blaise never truly fit into the Panaca lifestyle. She was a city girl trapped in a small town environment. Blaise is more of a free, wild, sort of rebellious girl. For example, her car license plate was a play on words. It actually spelled out the word fornicator. She did have friends out there, but there were also some kids there that she didn't really get along with. Sadly again, Blaise was sexually assaulted out in Panaca. And this led to a rise of rumours where she kind of got a reputation of being fast. So it was pretty inevitable that at some point she got into a fight when she was out in Panaca. During this altercation, Blaise actually took out a knife in defence, and this incident put her in alternative school. There she studied and got her GED. Blaise also became close to a teacher called Dixie Tienken. I want you to remember this name because Dixie becomes really relevant in this story later on. Anyway, once Blaise completed her GED and she was done with school, she was gone. She was out of Panaca. At 18, she left that tiny town and she went back to Las Vegas where she initially grew up, where she had spent her early childhood, 3 hours away. Blaise stayed in Las Vegas with some friends and she stayed there for periods of time between going back to Panaca and then going back to Las Vegas. She made friends out in Las Vegas and she stayed with them at the Budget Suites Motel on the east side. The east side of Vegas is, let's just say, kind of shady area. So she kind of worked as a dancer and she worked for her friend's fire extinguisher business out there. And she dibble-dabbled in some drugs. I guess many 18-year-olds kind of go through that phase where they move away from home, they're kind of rebelling, experiencing the good and the bad of life as they approach adulthood. So let's just say Blaise is going through that phase, trying to find herself. So one night in late May 2001, during Memorial Day weekend, Blaise was high on drugs and she was heading back to the Budget Suites Motel after a night out. Walking from her car through the motel parking lot, she suddenly was approached by a black man. He was giant in size, around 200 pounds, and he smelt really bad. This man pushed her to the ground, he slapped her, and then he tried to put his hand underneath her skirt. As I already explained, Blaise had already been a victim of some sexual assaults. So at this point, I'm pretty sure she was like, I'm not going to be a victim again. She was going to do anything she could prevent it because it was not going to happen today. So during this attack, Blaise, she managed to reach for a butterfly knife that her dad had given to her as some protection. And in her defense, Blaise struck out at the attacker's groin area. It's questionable whether Blaise actually cut him or whether the knife amputated his whole, like his genitals, his penis off. But personally, I imagine you probably would know that. But anyway, at this point, Blaise wasn't going to hang around to find out. She immediately got up, she fled to her car, and she didn't really see the extent of his injuries 100%. But she did know, and she was very clear on the fact that the black man who had attacked her was left alive and he was crying. So Blaise got in her car and she threw the butterfly blade out of her car. She was driving. She drove her car to her ex-boyfriend's house. He wasn't home, so she left her car parked there and made her way to a nearby church where she changed clothes. She never reported the attack because, well, before, in previous instances when she had reported attacks, the police hadn't really done much. So I guess that's kind of why she just left it. After this attack, Blaise decided that she needed a break from the fast Vegas city life. So in early July, she returned back to Panaca to her family house. I don't blame her for, wanting to chill out in a quiet town for a while, just till things died down. So whilst in Panaca, Blaise is really vocal about the incident that happened to her in Las Vegas. She told about a dozen friends about how she fought off an attacker with her butterfly knife. She also confided in Dixie. Remember the teacher I mentioned before who Dixie had befriended during her days in alternative school? Well, Dixie claimed that sometimes Blaise kind of exaggerated her stories and was a bit colourful in how she described things, so she doubted how serious this incident story was. But however, Dixie still told her friend Laura Johnson about it. So Laura Johnson was a juvenile probation officer. I'm not sure if, like, Dixie and Laura were mandated reporters or if they simply felt morally compelled to report a potential crime, but Laura ended up contacting Las Vegas Police Department. So she told them about the third account, the rumour that Blaise had cut off a man's penis. And once the detectives, Thomas Dowson and James LaRochelle, heard this report, they wasted no time in driving 3 hours up to see Laura to gather more info before they headed to Blaise's home in Panaca. When the detectives got to Blaise's home, Blaise was actually in the shower at the time, so her younger sister Ashley let the police officers in while they waited for Blaise. Blaise then came downstairs in her short bleached blonde hair and electric blue halter top, and she was then questioned in her home and no parents were present. At this point, a pivotal, avoidable misinterpretation happened due to the police's tunnel vision, and I would say this shaped the whole outcome of this case. So Blaise told the detectives about being attacked back in May. She told them it happened at least a month ago in the motel parking lots. So when the police detectives told her that the man had died, Blaise made expressions of remorse, because obviously she thought that she'd killed a man, right? The detectives took this as a confession, but at no point did Blaise actually confess to murder. And at no point during the questioning did the police actually state the location and the date of the murder they were investigating, nor did they ask further questions about the incident that happened at least a month ago. So the crime they were investigating actually happened 2 weeks ago, but they never told Blaise that. The incident that the police were investigating and the incident that Blaise had explained to the police were actually two separate incidents, very different events. So what incident were the police detectives referring to? Well, on 8th July 2001, a black homeless man by the name of Duran Bailey was found brutally beaten and murdered. He was left behind a dumpster with trash piled on top of his body to conceal it. His injuries were just horrific. His eyes were beaten black and blue. He had several stab wounds, a cracked skull, 6 of his teeth were knocked out, and the artery in his neck was severed. And probably the most significant injury that the detectives were stuck on was the fact that Bailey's penis had been fully cut off. His penis was found a few yards away from his body, and the autopsy confirmed that his penis had been cut off after he had been killed. So Blaise had described an incident where she had slashed at a man's groin area, and the police put 2 and 2 together and came up with 7 because their stories didn't even match up, like in any other way other than the mention of a black man and that he had potentially had a cut penis. So Blaise had told several people about this incident that occurred in May before Bailey could have even been killed. So just make that make sense, police. Anyway, let's go back to Bailey's homicide. When police officers were at the scene of his murder, a crowd of the local neighbours kind of gathered around to come out and look. And a woman who went by the name of Duran Bailey, she emerged at the crime scene, and she lived just across the street. Diane told the police that she believed that the murdered man was a man called Duran Bailey, and he went by the name of St. Louis. So how did Duran Bailey know Bailey? Well, she knew Bailey, and she knew that he often stayed and slept behind the dumpster. Diane explained that she was a victim of a really violent rape just a week ago, and the perpetrator was no one other than Bailey. Yes, the same man who was lying there murdered by the dumpster just across the street from Diane. So the next day was July the 9th, and the detectives went to visit Duran Bailey at her apartment for further questioning. Diane told the police that her and Bailey were acquaintances, and she occasionally exchanged sex with Bailey for drugs. She went on to say that on July the 1st, she was hanging out at her apartment complex with her neighbours, some Mexican guys. They were drinking beers, just hanging out. And Bailey rocked up, and Diane and Bailey got into a little argument. Bailey ended up slapping her across the face, and her neighbours, the Mexican men, saw all of this. They obviously threatened Bailey, told him to leave Diane alone. However, Bailey didn't leave Diane alone. Later that same day, Bailey came back to Diane's apartment, and that's when he raped her. He beat her eyes black and blue, causing deep bruising to her body. Bailey tried to sodomize her, and he held a knife to her neck during the attack. He threatened to kill her if Diane told anybody. So it's not surprising that with the threat of her life, Diane didn't report the crime initially due to fear of Bailey retaliating, and possibly because she had some open warrants. However, 3 days later, Bailey attempted to return to Diane's apartment. So at this point, Diane didn't really have a choice, and she did report it to the police that time. She even asked the police officers for protection when she reported it, but they didn't offer any. And they told her basically she had to do what she had to do to defend herself if he tried to attack her again. So I understood that Diane was so scared for her life, and without any police protection, she just didn't really want to pursue that rape case any further. But note that Bailey had an extensive criminal record. This, mugshot of his was taken when he had a domestic violence case, so you already know he was a violent man towards women. So after Bailey's murder, with the police at Diane's apartment, they checked her shoes and checked her clothing for any evidence or blood, and they also checked her roommates, and they found nothing. So Diane was basically ruled out as a suspect of the case. So what about her Mexican neighbours, right? What about them? Who had just threatened Bailey a few days earlier. Of course, the police pursued that line of inquiry, right? Diane didn't want to mention too much about her Mexican neighbors because she kind of suspected that they might have been in the USA illegally, but she did give the police their apartment number. So the detectives did go and check out these neighbors with the apartment complex owner, and he told them that they never caused any, trouble in the complex. The police then ran the names that the apartment owner gave them, and nothing came up. But in my opinion, if they were in the USA illegally, they probably used some fake names or had fake ID. So it's unlikely that anything would show in any database. And just because their names didn't show in a database didn't mean that they, didn't kill Bailey. Just because they didn't have any priors on the system didn't mean that they weren't guilty. But the fact that the detectives didn't even at bare minimum speak to the Mexicans, it just screams lazy detective work. They didn't check their apartments for any evidence, any blood, any DNA, any weapons, just like nothing. I mean, there was a clear motive for the Mexican neighbors to avenge Diane. Their friend was raped. So it just baffles me why the police didn't even follow up on this at all. But what takes the cake was when Detective Falson was asked why they didn't pursue the Mexican line of inquiry. And he said some words to the effect of, well, it was a long day and we were getting tired, and at some point you have to call it a day. Like what? I'll just leave that quote there for you to comment your opinions on, because it's like, I don't know.
The murder of Duran Bailey was consistent with a revenge killing. Diane Parker had black eyes. This guy had his eyes pounded by a baseball bat. Diane Parker had been raped, and she had been raped anally. And this man's penis was severed, and there was a knife in his rectum. What do you think might have been a motive there?
So let's get back to the story of Blaise Lobato. So now she's been charged with the murder of Bailey, despite her story about a separate incident not matching up with the details of Bailey's murder. Blaise believed in the criminal justice system. She thought there's no way she could be convicted of something she didn't actually do. So the truth must come out in court, right?
And at that point, to be honest with you, I really believed in the system. So I figured if I told them the truth, that everything would be okay.
But whilst Blaise was awaiting trial in the county detention centre, another inmate, Karina Martin, actually snitched on Blaise. Karina testified that Blaise told her all the gory details of the Bailey murder. Karina stated that Blaise told her that he deserved it and even bragged that it was overkill. Karina's testimony was key in undermining Blaise's defense arguments. Blaise argued that she didn't actually cut off her attacker's penis, yet Corinda concocted this elaborate, detailed story that Blaise had told her that she indeed cut it off and shoved the amputated penis down his throat. But remember, Bailey's cut off penis was found a few yards away from him, right? And the detectives knew this because they were at the scene. So they must have known that there was some glaring inconsistencies with what Corinda was telling them and what they were actually investigating. Side note, I did do a little look-see into Corinda character in general, and let's just say this Corinda Martin woman there was a lot of shady stuff going on. Like, for example, she got pregnant while she was in prison with a correction officer in Las Vegas. This is clearly wrong on the correction officer's part. However, Corinda did lie. She said that she was raped. However, in court, text messages were exposed that showed that the encounters with her and her correction officer were clearly pre-planned. So she was lying. Then when she got out of prison, her and her husband got in a heated argument She got in a car chase happened, and the car got rammed off the road and he shot her. This could be a whole true crime story in itself, but let's get back to Blaise's case. So, with Kirstin's false testimony in 2002 of May, Blaise was convicted of a minimum of 20 to 50 years. The charges were murder in the first degree, the use of a deadly weapon, and for sexual penetration of a dead body. Blaise was just 19 years old at the time. However, as I said, Kirstin was no model informant. Her reliability as a witness was being questioned because she had previously tried every single trick in the book to get out of prison or to get her sentence lessened. She was a prisoner that would do and say anything to get out of jail, to get herself off the hook. She would even lie on Blaise, which she did, in order to get her sentence reduced. So later, Kirstin was found to have lied in the courtroom about writing some letters, and a handwriting analysis confirmed that Kirstin was indeed a liar. So Kirstin's testimony as a whole was scrutinized, and it was found that the court had erred in including Kirstin's testimony in Blaise's trial. So Blaise's original conviction was reversed in 2004, and a new trial was set for 2006. So yes, you're thinking, Blaise, she finally has a chance to prove her innocence and set the record straight and finally be freed of this crime at the second trial. But no. In this second trial, the jury convicted her again, but this time of a lesser offence of voluntary manslaughter. Blaise was resentenced to 13 to 35 years in prison. Obviously less than her first sentence, but who cares? She's still not free. The state is still viewing her as a guilty woman when she's innocent. Some say this second conviction was merely the judge trying to find a compromise rather than genuinely finding Blaise guilty, because the facts of the case didn't support that. It only supported being first degree murder or just innocence. There was no middle ground. But anyway, Blaise was sent back to prison a second time despite absolutely no evidence linking her to the crime.
Lobato's friends and family said the second conviction was even more difficult than the first one.
My daughter's been in prison now for 15 years for something that she didn't commit, and a murderer is running around out there because these guys didn't do their job.
But how could an innocent person be mistakenly convicted twice? The detectives mischaracterized Blaise's whole case. They made it appear that Blaise was describing Bailey's murder rather than the early assault that happened. They omitted to let her know that the attack that they were investigating happened a few weeks later after her incident. They failed to let her know where the murder actually occurred, because Blaise made it very clear that she was attacked in the Budget Suites parking lots on the east side of Vegas near Boulder Highway and Nellis Cross Streets. Blaise explained the location in great detail. She said it was near a place called Sam's Town. She said it was across the street from a shopping centre and around the corner from a water fountain, all very specific. However, Bailey's body was found much further west of the city, roughly 7 to 8 miles away from where Blaise described her attack. So the detectives made it seem as if Blaise was attacked at the same place that Bailey was, murdered. But Blaise never expressed any doubt about the location, and she didn't mention being near Flamingo Road. So please tell me why the detective's report stated Blaise believed that she was near Flamingo Road. Because Bailey was killed off West Flamingo Road, so they had to somehow shoehorn Flamingo Road into their made-up scenarios. The police didn't follow up on any of these glaring discrepancies between Blaise's account and the details of the actual Bailey murder. So yet again, just lazy detective work, or perhaps even a sinister, calculated attempt to frame a young woman.
I thought, oh my gosh, I killed somebody. I didn't realize until much later that they were talking about something completely different.
They had their suspect, and no matter what, they were sticking to it, regardless of whether the facts and the evidence supported this or not. Like, they had Blaise, and she was going to be it. So in my opinion, Blaise could not have murdered Bailey due to several reasons, several compelling reasons. Just to highlight a few that stood out to me, I would start with, firstly, there was no physical evidence to support the prosecution's case. The fresh car tracks at the scene didn't link to Blaise's red Fiero car. The bloody footprint at the scene was a men's size 10 sneaker. It was a Walmart sneaker, and Blaise's shoe size is much smaller. The stab wounds that were on Bailey's body were not caused by a butterfly knife, but a double-edged barbering knife. Blaise's baseball bat that she had in her car that they said that she used was actually inconsistent with, Bailey's injuries. When baseball bats are used to repeatedly bludgeon somebody, they leave a very distinct blood pattern in the shape of an arc, and that wasn't found at the scene of the crime. Forensics also determined that the manner in which Bailey was attacked and the locations of all his various injuries strongly suggested that it was multiple attackers. This was due to the angles and the placement of all the cuts that were inflicted on him. So at the time of the alleged attack, Blaise weighed only 100 pounds, and it would have been really difficult for somebody of her build to have caused the extent of Bailey's injuries, especially if they said Blaise was working alone. There were no cuts, no bruises to Blaise's arms or fingers, which would be expected after a beating of that magnitude. So basically, the prosecution just created a scenario that one 18-year-old female did this crime. Like, just stop it, come off it. Prior to the trial, Blaise even did a polygraph lie detector test where the examiner found that she was being truthful, and when she denied any involvement in the case, in the murder, she was telling the truth. And there were no witnesses, and the police were simply going off circumstantial evidence. Secondly, I believe Blaise was innocent because the dates, the times, the location of Bailey's murder just didn't match up. It was just impossible. Unless Blaise was able to alter physics and time travel, it was just impossible. Blaise's attack in the Budget Suites parking lot occurred in May 2001, and she had told several people about this attack before Bailey had even been murdered. And he was seen alive after May. Remember when he raped Diane Parker? That was in July 2001, so obviously he was alive then. Bailey was killed on 8th of July 2001, approximately 6 weeks after Blaise was attacked. We know Bailey was killed on July the 8th, as a forensic pathologist testified that his death happened within a window of up to 18 hours before the discovery of his body at 10 p.m. So he was definitely murdered on July the 8th. Interestingly, based on outdoor location, it would have been expected to see his body filled with blowfly eggs. All his wounds and orifices just would have had blowfly eggs present, and they didn't. In addition to the stage of rigor mortis that his body was in, it was narrowed down, the time frame of when he was actually killed. And they believe that time frame was closer to the 10 p.m. time frame of when he was actually discovered. So possibly 2 hours before that. And at that time, Blaise was in Panaca, 3 hours away, 170 miles away, with her family. So she had an alibi placing her in Panaca at the time. And I believe she had roughly 13 people who were alibis. Some were her friends and family, and they were so frustrated that the court didn't really allow them to speak up about this in court, because unfortunately, during the trial, the judge severely limited the testimony of the alibis and didn't even allow some of the most compelling defense to be heard by the jury. Lastly, I'm going to mention another key reason why Blaise should have been proven innocent. Total lack of DNA evidence. Absolutely zilch, zero, nada, nothing. No DNA evidence linking her to Bailey's murder. No fingerprints, no hairs, no bodily fluids of Blaise was ever found on the scene or on or near Bailey's body. There's also a fact of the case that I just can't seem to get past, like semen was found in Bailey's rectum, indicating he was sodomized. This semen lacked sperm, and at the time of the trial, the DNA testing, the technology didn't really exist to identify a DNA profile from semen that didn't have sperm. But clearly the semen came from a man, and Blaise isn't a man. It was confirmed that this type of assault is consistent with a male-on-male encounter. So please tell me why Blaise is getting convicted for that offence. It doesn't make sense. And to this date, all the research I've done, I've just been unable to confirm whose DNA that was. But, if anyone has done any research in this case and knows who that semen belonged to, please let me know down in the comments, because this part of the case is just baffling me. It's just not making any sense. Organisations such as Justice Denied magazine and the Innocence Project advocate for the wrongly convicted. They petitioned and put arguments forth about the need for updated DNA testing on several pieces of additional evidence, because technology had advanced. I mean, if we have the technology now, let's use it, because this will give us more leads. And even though Blaise has been ruled out, we don't actually know who did the crime. So even though DNA testing has ruled out Blaise, it's got to match somebody, right? They advocated for evidence such as cigarette butts, filter paper, chewing gum that were all left at the scene to be tested because it wasn't, as well as clothing and jewellery belonging to Bailey, because they could match that with the current crime databases. The Innocent Project even went as far as to offer to pay for all this DNA testing out of their pocket, but the state consistently denied their offers.
There's going to be saliva on those. There's going to be DNA. And we begged them to test the DNA, and they wouldn't.
So at this point, I truly think that it's cognitive dissonance at this point, because I feel like the state knew that they had wrongly convicted Blaise, but they had gone too far. They had put her in prison for too long, and it was just gone too far that they didn't want to admit it. So because the level of, miscarriage of justice would be so bad, it would just be crazy. There was a petition of over 150,000 people who had signed the petition in support, begging for further DNA testing to be allowed in this case to prove Blaise's innocence. This just goes to show the level of support she had from the general public, which I wouldn't really say is common for someone who was convicted of a murder and who had spent years in prison.
Wilson, test the DNA!
This isn't just about Kirstin's innocence, it's about finding the real killers.
Her father, Larry Lobato, and her stepmother, Becky, they were really vocal in advocating for her, as well as another mother figure, Michelle Ravel.
I knew she didn't do it because she was with me and us 175 miles away. And her going into this trial, I knew she was innocent, so I figured no matter what, they can't prove it because there's no DNA, there's no nothing.
Do you foresee a day that she's going to get out of there and come walking straight into your house?
Absolutely. That day, when I can finally have my family in my house, all having an actual meal together instead of eating out of a vending machine, that's the day I've been waiting for.
They insisted from the very beginning that Blaise was innocent, and their support never wavered, even though she was convicted not once, but twice. They knew their daughter. I can't imagine the sadness, the anger, the helplessness that you could feel if your family member was locked up for something you knew they didn't do. Like, the range of emotions you must feel is enough to make anybody lose it, I guess. The Lobatos did state that it did put a really big strain on their relationship because it was such a tough period. And her dad and stepmother even turned to drugs. So it's just sad at the domino effect that this wrong conviction, well, twice, could have on a family. And my heart goes out to Ashley as well, Blaise's younger sister, because so many memories they could have had together over the years were just snatched away. Prison visits just, it's not enough, is it? Ashley always maintained that, you know, Blaise was innocent because she knew that her sister was in Panaca at the time, so it was just impossible for her to be guilty of Bailey's murder. So, how did Blaise eventually get exonerated in 2017? Well, the Innocent Project successfully secured her exoneration by proving that she was indeed in Panaca, which was 3 hours away at the time of Bailey's death. But by that time when she was released in 2018, she'd already spent 16 years in prison at that point. Just imagine, just let that sink in. Think about all the things you can and have done in a 16-year time frame. In 2019, Blaise filed federal charges against the Las Vegas Police Department and against the 2 police detectives. But it wasn't till 2024 that she was finally awarded $34 million. Yes, $34 million for the wrongful convictions. The jury found that the detectives Dawson and La Rochelle had actually fabricated evidence and they had inflicted emotional distress upon Blaise. So in addition to the $34 million, she was also awarded $10,000 in punitive damages from each of the detectives. But is that even enough? Importantly though, Blaise was formally issued with a certificate of innocence. And this is more than just the case being thrown out. It's actually, you know, giving a statement saying that the state regards her as an innocent person. But this recent verdict sparked some controversy. Some have urged the state attorney general to appeal. So sadly, this might not be the last time I'm making a video on this because they seem intent on dragging this case, this whole ordeal on longer. But who knows? We will see. Hopefully not. Ultimately, Blaise is now free after 16 years in prison, 16 long years, for a crime she didn't even commit. She didn't even know Bailey. She hadn't even been near him in her life. Alibi testimony wasn't heard. There was an untrustworthy informant used. The detectives misled the people hearing the case by serious omissions and their attempts to just paper over facts that didn't fit with their narrative. It was all because of a rumor that spread like Chinese whispers that embellished the story of Blaise slicing an attacker's groin to describing it as cutting a man's whole penis off. Just a catalogue of unjust mistakes. The overzealous prosecution conjured up a scenario of Blaise on a rampage, looking for drugs. Then she snapped and lost her cool at a man and beat him up to a pulp. It's just a messy lie, really. I'm so happy that Blaise finally got released, but at the same time, I'm like sad because she had to endure this. She had to go on this wild journey, and it's unreal, but the story is real. Blaise is a real person. Imagine being 18 years old and being locked up at 19 and then not seeing freedom for 16 years. That's your whole youth gone. Honestly, can $34 million really make up for that? Because essentially they stole a whole chunk of her life and didn't even have the decency to give her a sincere apology, and now they're trying to appeal. Blaise and her family have just been so resilient through this whole ordeal. When I see Blaise speak now, she speaks with such poise and grace, and I don't know if I could be that good of a woman, to be honest, if someone did that to me. All her supporters and professionals that help secure her justice, some working pro bono for free, are just amazing people. But what's upsetting is that Blaise, she states that she has some uncertainty about her future. She said, "I have no idea what the rest of my life is going to look like." She fears that she's kind of been institutionalized. But something about her aura seems so strong to me. She's literally been through one of the toughest struggles that someone can go through, and she's come too far to come too far. I hope this story opens your eyes to some of the injustice in the criminal system. I also hope it inspires you to never give up. You know, if you're facing what seems like a dead end, all hope isn't lost. You can successfully fight to restore justice and your innocence. This is the story of Kirstin Blaise Lobato, a free, innocent woman.